There's a quote somewhere that says it should cost nothing to make a YouTube video. Well, in this video, I want to talk about the economics of an artist-led project and why I'm leaving this space to do more of this. Hey, my name's Dean, and for the last 8 years, I've worked in the artist-led spaces in and around Manchester. In this video, I really want to talk about the ways I've worked within those spaces and the economics of artist-led spaces. So stuff like how much things cost, exhibition structures, funding, all of these things that maybe are not super spoken about all the time or are kind of hard to find. Maybe let's just zoom out for a sec and think about what is an artist-led space, or as I like to call it, a creative-led space. An artist-led space is somewhere where artists are working to make exhibitions, and these people also make their own stuff, their own artwork, and work independently of that space. I prefer the term, creative-led, because sometimes it might be that the people running the gallery or running the artist-led space, not necessarily making artwork, but making other things, which is maybe different to places like museums or bigger galleries. I suppose that term then comes with conditions around how the space might function, and that it might be a bit more casual, but maybe not a person or a group of people's central practice. Within an artist-led space, it is people who are running the space are also practitioners in and of themselves, and so have maybe a different knowledge of what art making is like, and so that can feed into the way that they curate shows or make shows. So first, I just want to give you an overview of the 3 different spaces I've had over the last 8 years. I'll go into detail about each of them. This just gives you a kind of general view. So between 2014 and 2015, I had a space in a place called Rogue Project Space, which was part of a bigger studio complex called Rogue Studios within the centre of Manchester. Now before that, I was at uni, so I came straight out of uni and graduated and then moved into that space. Then between 2016 and 2019, I had a space in a place called Regent's Trading Estate within Salford, which was a space next to a bigger studio complex called Islington Mill. And then more recently, from 2021, I had this space, which I've mainly been presenting things online on YouTube for digital consumption rather than physical public consumption. So just a quick disclaimer before I kind of move on is that I'm going to outline stuff like costs and funding and exhibition structure, and this is just the ways I've done things and kind of learn myself over time. Now within all these projects, it's just been me kind of creative directing, curating, whatever you want to call it. And so really it's been a case of practicing as you go, and often practicing in public. And every time it's really been about thinking about the different exhibition structures and the way the exhibition structures work and what is the kind of optimal format for artists and for me and for the spaces themselves. But hopefully it gives you an overview of how these things work and how I've sort of developed the financial thinking and the models and ways of working over time. So in the first space was in Rogue Project Space, as I said, in the centre of Manchester between July 2014 and July 2015, and this was an 81 metre square space. And so firstly, the costs for this were free. So this was a space that was a curatorial residency, so they gave the space away for free, and in doing so you would make exhibitions for the public, and that was maybe like a condition of the space. Within this space, because we were only there for a single year, because the residency was there for a single year, and because the space was part of an existing building that had like a 25-year history, and we were able to get funding for this space to do a series of shows. So we got £15,000 of funding. Within this space, it was really about figuring out the ways I want to make exhibitions with people and figuring out different models and ways that, really work for me. So here in this first space, we did 2 to 4 person exhibitions, and really this started off as around 4 person exhibitions at the start and then moved to 2 person exhibitions towards the end, because I felt it gave firstly more money to each of the artists, and also it kind of made each of the artists do more interesting things. For each of these we had £1,000 per show, so this was obviously split different amounts depending on how many people were in the show. And over the whole year we were there, did around about, I counted, but I'm not too sure about this, 10 exhibitions. And over that time I was in there, I sort of developed an understanding of the ways I wanted to make exhibitions that did narrow itself down from these kind of bigger group shows towards 2-person exhibitions, which I just felt were more interesting and more dynamic. For an example, Oliver Hickmer and Mikey Cook's installation, what was it called? 24K Gold Rita. And this was really like a model of, a type of exhibition I really wanted to continue making in future spaces. So then I had a short gap between moving out of that space and moving into the next space, which was in Regent's trading estate in Salford, just behind Islington Mill, which is a kind of large creative studio in Salford. And here was really about extending what I'd already experimented with in that first space and figuring out a sort of more long-term model for how to run an artist-led space and make exhibitions, but also stretch the ambition by being in a bigger space. So this space was 640 meters squared, which I think it was about 16 by 40 meters across 3 different spaces. There was a shopfront space, a warehouse space, and then this large fridge space, like a large fridge, not like a large fridge. And yeah, it was really about pushing the ambition and possibilities of an artist-led space within Greater Manchester. I'll just drill through the cost. So the rent was £500 per month, and this was really because this space was supported by Salford City Council and Islington Mill. And that rent is cheap on paper because it was really supporting the cultural growth of the area, trying to push Salford as a creative place for artists to not only live and make work, but exhibit. The electric bills were then between like £80 and £300 a month. So this varied quite like rapidly over, between summer and winter. And then this also varied because of the studio spaces we had in there. So over time, we built more studio spaces, so that added more people, more electric. And then obviously over winter, more people were colder. Thirdly, with this was like the maintenance cost. So because this is a big space, the maintenance costs were bigger compared to some of the smaller spaces I'd had because of the size of the space, but also because of the nature of the space. And I'll talk about that more in depth in a bit. And then in terms of funding, so within the space, I had over 3 years, different amounts of funding, one of £15,000, one of £10,000, and one bigger one of £20,000 from the Arts Council. And then there was the £5,000 from the Beautiful Ideas Company in Liverpool, which was a creative business loan company, basically enabling like creative businesses to start up. And then finally, there's studio rentals. I put it in funding, but it's basically income, which were between £1,000 and £2,500 per month. Now this varied depending on how many studios we had, and also then how many people were in the studios at any given time. So I just want to talk about the exhibition structures, and I really split this up into 2 time periods. So between 2016 and 17, and then 2018 to 19. Within the first one, it was really about experimenting with the ways of making exhibitions, and then using that information, using that sort of knowledge to think about how you could make more optimal exhibitions, or what was the better models for making exhibitions. So in that second time period, it was really about honing in on a specific type of exhibition making, and then really making that ambitious. So the first one between 2016 and 2017 was mainly 2-person exhibitions. There was some larger group exhibitions, and all of these, they were site-specific in their nature. So the whole warehouse had 3 different spaces available that we could use. Sometimes we would use all that space, sometimes we would use just 1 or 2 in different cases. So the cost of these exhibitions was between £1,000 and £1,500 per show. And obviously with a 2-person exhibition, that money is then just split in half. With all of these shows, and this has just been my way of working, is that I've usually kind of bulked all the artist fees and materials into kind of one pot, and that I've left it up to the artist to decide how they use that. And really this is about giving the artist the freedom to use that money how they see fit, with the advice that this percentage should be for artist fee, this percentage should be for materials. But if they're a painter and they've already made the work, it might be that the materials is kind of, backdated, whereas other artists might want to use the materials fee to build new things for the show. So it's really just giving the artist the freedom to use that money how they wish. So then within the second time period between 2018 and 2019 was really a focus on solo exhibitions. Now this was developed from a solo exhibition I did with an artist called Gabriel Birch, which was a sort of experiment to see how solo exhibitions could work within such a large space. So for that specific show, we took a 3-month time period and built the show over different weeks over 3 months. I spent about £1,000 in the show, and I think Gabriel also spent about £1,000 in the show, which was sort of like an agreement we sort of came to in spending equal amounts and really experimenting in this space to figure out how solo shows could be made, but also for him to figure out bigger installations and bigger works that he might have not had the chance to do in other spaces. Then that really helped to kind of solidify how a solo exhibition could work in such a large space, and this fed into the model that became the structure for how we made exhibitions between this time period. So all of the solo shows maintain this kind of site-specific installation nature, in that I wanted artists to make new work in the space that was specific to the site, which was a kind of disused industrial warehouse, and so had interesting aspects that you might not find in a white cube gallery. And then they would use all 3 spaces within the space, plus an outdoor commission, which was a thing we experimented with on Gabriel's exhibition and sort of became embedded in the ways we would make future exhibitions because it was an interesting way to engage the public in what we were doing on the inside. So then for the solo exhibitions we did through the £20,000 we got from the Arts Council for Emma Talbot, Hannah Farrell and then Anna Gonzalez Noguchi, each of these cost £4,000 per show, and that was split between £2,500 for artist fees and then £1,500 for materials. Now that material cost is quite big because the space would suck up materials quite readily. And equally with the artist fees, I'd figured out that when we'd done the exhibition with Gabriel, the solo shows at that scale took a long amount of time, and so the artist fees needed to account for that time period because usually it would take between 10 to 14 days to make an exhibition, and so that fee needed to really cover an artist's time significantly. That £4,000 is really like an important amount in that it allows artists to really stretch their practice beyond what they might imagine in other spaces and smaller spaces, and give them the materials and the amount of money to make things that they otherwise might not make, but also allows them to realize ideas that maybe have been kept on the back burner for a while. So for instance, Emma Talbot's show, we made this kind of large conical structure in the fridge space, which was an idea she said to me that she'd never been able to realize but had thought about doing for a long time. And that's a really important thing for an artist, to be able to get out the ideas that are in their head. She then went on to win the Max Mara Art Prize for Women and is now at the Venice Biennale. I suppose in those two things it confirms that by giving artists a large budget to make exhibitions, it really allows them to stretch their practice and to move on in their career in more interesting ways. Now, before I move on to the costs and sort of economics of this space, I just want to talk about the problems with free or cheap space. So both of the last spaces were either free or cheap, and within that type of space, the freeness or the cheapness obviously has sort of catches or comes with certain conditions. So really with these types of spaces, you're kind of spending time or money, or there's other catches involved that mean that the money that's not spent is kind of there somewhere in different forms. One of the things is temporariness. So in all of these spaces, there's a temporariness to free or cheap space. Sometimes in terms of the first space, it's that you've only got a given year to do things in. In other places, it might be that the spaces have a time limit and are going to be bulldozed or gentrified or turned into something new, and you're just there as sort of momentary cultural capital, which is, has its good and bads. Has its pros and cons. The second thing then, because of that temporariness, is also that the building quality can be variable. Free or cheap spaces usually have a lesser building quality because they're not maintained to the standards that a rentable space might be. And really that's just like a general thing to be aware of, because if a building has a lack of quality or is not well kept, there could be maintenance costs involved in keeping that to a certain standard. For instance, in Gabriel's show, one of the skylights blew off in a storm. There's a freeness involved, but you're really paying through other means, or you might pay later on through maintenance of that space. So then in this space, I moved in February 2021, and this is 72 meters squared space. So just running through the costs of this space first. So we've got £325 for rent per month. Then electric bills are £2 per month. Weirdly cheap here, I don't know why. 1 month it was like 57p. And then business rates are £75 per month. I think this is a key one that people forget about, especially if you're taking on commercial space for the first time. Business rates are the equivalent of council tax that you pay on a house, but for a business property. I obviously knew they sort of half existed, but I'd never really had to pay them. So if you don't have to pay things, you don't really care about it. But it's a thing to consider if you're thinking about taking on a commercial space for an artist-led project. Couldn't think of the word then. So in this section, I've not put a heading for funding because the space has been funded by my own wage. Really, within the space, it's been an experiment in seeing how far a wage can take you. But really, if I could self-sustain this through separate means that is not funding or free or cheap space. So I've been paying all the costs in terms of the rent and the electric bills, the business rates, and then the show costs through my own wage. And really it was about thinking about the control of the whole situation and kind of removing all those other things that are involved if you take free or cheap space, or if you're getting funding and the things involved in those kind of processes. So application forms, evaluation forms, but then obviously that comes at a cost of, money coming out of your own wage. But I think this has been a really important experiment for me to kind of figure out how this works, if this works. I suppose the reason I'm doing this video is because I don't think it necessarily does work long term, but it's an interesting thing short term. But it's nice to kind of try these things, iterate kind of rapidly, and challenge how you might then build future shows based on what you now know. So yeah, I've been paying this out of my own wage. In my day job, I'm a teacher, maths teacher.
For those who haven't seen integration by substitution before, this shit's gonna f you up.
So for the exhibition structure here, we've only had solo exhibitions, and this is really based off what I found in the past through the solo exhibitions in the last space, the ways I found it most interesting to work with artists on a one-on-one basis and really experiment with their practice in a really personal way that helps them develop new ideas and new things. As with all the other shows, it's always been site-specific installations, and then here it's been £1,000 per show. And this is really, up to the artist in terms of how much they want to spend on fees, how much they want to spend on materials. But also specifically here, it's been non-public and then film only. And this is also like a cost thing that maybe isn't explicit, but if you're putting in time and effort into opening for the public, so in the last space I was open Thursdays and Saturdays, 1 till 5, the cost of your time is as much as the cost of, other things. So really the exhibition structure has really been about reducing the time in the space to optimize for visual content, for making films, for making exhibitions. So I just want to outline some hidden financials. So paying yourself is a big one. Here, it's been nothing because I've just been paying out of my own wage. In the first space, in Rogue Project Space, there was a fee of £1,500, which is actually not very much. In the second space, that then varied between £10,000 per annum and £16,000 per annum. Now this varied depending on a couple of factors. So the amounts of funding we got. So in the later stages where we got something like £20,000, that allowed me to have a bigger wage. But it also varied depending on how many people were in the studios and how much income I could take from the studio setup. Then also I think it's just important to think about time is money and how much time you're putting into an artist-led project. It's really easy to spend a lot of time doing it and you're not getting financial return off it. And therefore it's just important to think about how much value you get out of the project compared to how much time you put in it. Then the other thing is materials. So even though there's been materials fees included in funding amounts that I've mentioned, I think it's really important to think about being economical with materials when you're building exhibitions, and that being economical can allow you to make even more better things, even more interesting things if you've utilized materials in an economical way. For instance, in terms of Gabriel's show, we used free VHS tape to build a 20-meter installation. And then finally, there was studios and gallery visits. Even though these might not seem important, it obviously is a cost to kind of think about in terms of travel and how much it costs to go to people, go to places, go to studios or see exhibitions. So finally, I want to talk about why I'm leaving this space. There's a couple of reasons, but the main one is sort of money and how much I'm putting in and then how much is kind of coming out in terms of cultural content. And that really, I think I can do this more economically through filmmaking means rather than through building shows and filming shows and everything happening here. It's really about a focus on how there's more interesting things that are happening outside in the world that I can film and visit and see and do, and that the art doesn't just have to happen in the spaces that I make it happen in. But in terms of paying rent monthly over a long time period, it didn't feel valuable to me to be putting in that amount of money, and that it was easier or more optimal to go and filmmake in different people's studios and galleries, and the costs involved are much cheaper. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe, give us a like, and I'll see you in the next one.